The bell for St. Feo rang at the 4th hour, and Aurelius Venn was already at her table in the census hall, the cold of the marble coming up through the soles of her boots, the way it always did before an airing. She did not look up at the sound. The bell was for the gun priests and the crowds in the forecourt. It was not for her. Our work began earlier and ended later than any liturgy, in the gap between when the cleanup unit filed its tally and when the barrage was loosed, the narrow hour in which she made the two halves of the city agree with each other. St. Veho's ward. Eastern terraces, 6 streets, a chapel with a collapsed roof that had not been census kept in a year. She drew the ward map toward her by its corner, the soot still on it from the last firing, and smoothed it flat. The cleanup slip lay beside the map, damp at the edges from the rain that came up through the stone joints of the building, no matter the season. She read the unit's number first, as procedure required, before she let herself look at her own. 203. A clean tally, the kind a tired crew produced when a ward had emptied itself slowly and there was little left to count. She wrote it at the head of her sheet and underlined it. Then she began her own count, which was the only prayer she knew. She did it the way she had done it for 19 years, intake by intake, slip by slip. Each death entered against its ward and its hour and the saint who ruled the day it fell. She did not hurry. Hurrying was how rounding crept in, how a 4 became a 5, because the candle guttered and the eye was tired. The tallow smoked. Outside, the processional was forming. She could hear the shuffle of it through the wall, the dragging of feet that had walked to 100 airings and trusted the calendar to be right about them. It always had been. That was the thing she leaned on, the way another woman might lean on a husband or a god. The schedule had never, in living memory, fired on a ward that was not already dead. The dead did not feel the airing. That was the mercy of it. That was what her thumbprint was for. She reached the bottom of the intake slips and totaled them, and her pen stopped. 192. She sat very still. The number on her sheet and the number on theirs were not the same, and the difference was 11. 11 was not a large number. In a ward of 200 souls, it was the breath of a rounding error, the kind of slippage that came of crews counting in smoke and clerks counting by candle. She had seen worse and corrected it without a second thought, had folded a discrepancy of 20 back into agreement before the bell more than once because crews overcounted. That was the shape of every error she had ever met. A tired unit walking a ruined ward saw bodies in every doorway and logged the shadows as the slain. Their number was always the larger one. Hers was the smaller, the careful one, the one that found fewer dead because she would not write a death she could not name. But this time, her number was the smaller one, and theirs was the larger, and that meant the 11 were not bodies they had imagined. They were bodies she could not find. She read it again, the way you read a word that has come apart from its meaning. 203 logged dead. 192 she could account for by name, by hour, by the slip that had carried each of them in. 11 souls the cleanup unit had counted as corpses, and she had no corpse for. 11 the city believed were dead, that she could not make dead, however carefully she counted. The bell rang again. The second peal, the firing peal, and the floor of the census hall took up its long, low shudder as the eastern guns spoke. Dust sifted from the vault. The flame of her candle lay flat and stood up again. Somewhere across the city, St. Veho's ward was being aired, exactly on schedule, exactly as trusted, and her hand was already moving toward the wax to seal the clearance that said it was right to do so. She stopped her hand. She looked at the 11. Then she did what humility had taught her to do first, every time, for 19 years. She assumed that the fault was hers, and she reached for the intake slips to count them again. The morning after St. Veho's airing came in grey through the high-slit windows, and Aurelius Venn began again from the beginning, because the beginning was the only place she trusted. She did not believe the error was theirs. That was not how she had been trained, nor how she lived. When a count failed, a registrar's first duty was to suspect her own hand, and she performed that duty now the way she performed all of them, slowly, without complaint, with the cold of the marble desk seeping up through her sleeves. 11 souls. The number sat in her ledger like a stone in a shoe. She would find where she had dropped them. She laid the intake slips out in their hours. They came to her each shift, on coarse paper, thumbed and damp, smelling of the wards, that sour sweet reek of medicine gone over, of poultices left too long against fevered skin. She counted them by hour and by saint's bell, sliding each into its column with the flat of her finger. The soot-marked ward map she unrolled and weighted at the corners with the lead seals she kept for the purpose. St. Feho's quarter was a smudge of streets she had never warped and never would, charcoaled at the edges where previous airings had been logged, and the parchment scorched by the candle she read it under. She tallied the board next. The tally board was a slate the height of a man, chalked in her own small upright hand, and she went down it line by line, touching each figure, speaking the sums under her breath so her eye could not skip what her mouth had not said. It was tedious work. It was meant to be. Tedium was the registrar's only honesty. A quick count was a lie that had not yet been caught. Her arithmetic was clean. She did it twice more to be sure, and it remained clean, and that was the first thing that frightened her. Not the discrepancy itself, but the absence of her own fault. The way the floor she had always stood on turned out to hold. The 11 were not a slip of her pen. They were in the slips. They had come in alive, by their own intake marks, admitted, fevered, then noted recovering in the crabbed shorthand of the ward orderlies. 11 that the clean-up unit's final tally had folded into the dead. She took up the clean-up slip and held it to the candle. It was a standard form, the same she had handled 10,000 times, and at first she saw nothing but a number and a seal over it, as there was always a number and a seal. Then she tilted it, and the wax caught the light at a low angle, and she saw what the flat reading had hidden. The figure beneath the print was not the figure she had been given. The original count had been written and corrected, not crossed out, not initialed in the margin as a lawful amendment must be, but overwritten, the old digit pressed down and a new one set upon it. And over the correction, sealing it, was a thumbprint in wax. She knew the sequence of the rite better than she knew her own face. The tally was completed first. Then it was brought to her. Then she sealed it. The wax went on last, after the count was fixed, as the proof that the count was fixed. A print could not lawfully sit over a correction, because by the time anything bore a print, there was nothing left to correct. This one did. The number had been changed after the slip was sealed, and then sealed again, a second wax laid over the first, so smoothly that only the candle at the right slant would tell. Someone had broken the right open, altered what it was meant to preserve, and closed it back over the wound. Auralis set the slip down very carefully, as though it might wake. She did not let herself think past the paper. That was a discipline too. The harm in front of her was a procedural harm, and she would treat it as one. A crew that had miscounted, or rushed, or fed her a fouled form to cover a slovenly shift. Forms existed for this. There was a refiling notice, the buff-colored one, and a supervisor of the clean-up unit to whom it went, and a line on it for the registrar's observed irregularity, which she would fill in her small upright hand. A crew could be retrained. A slip could be pulled and reissued. The schedule itself was not in question. The schedule was never in question. Only the count beneath it had gone wrong, and counts could be made right. She drew the buff notice toward her and uncapped her pen and began, because that was the next correct thing, and she had always done the next correct thing. The refiling form was a small mercy, and Auralis took comfort in it the way she took comfort in all small procedures. Form 14C, notification of tally discrepancy, suspected clerical. She had filled it out at her desk by the last of a candle stub, copying the altered slip's serial number twice so there could be no confusion, and she had carried it down to the relay box outside the cold storage levels herself rather than trust it to the morning runner. It was nothing. A crew had counted badly, a supervisor would be told. The ledger would correct itself, as the ledger always did, given a clean form and an honest hand. The service corridor on the Gene Vault sublevel was a place she had no real reason to enter, except that the relay box stood at its mouth and the route back to the sensor stair ran past its cold rooms. It was a narrow throat of a passage, marble gone grey with age, the joints between the slabs weeping a thin rain that the chill turned to beads rather than drops. The cold here had a smell to it, the way cold always did in the vaults. Old wax, ozone from the cryo coils, and under that the sour-sweet ghost of spoiled medicine, the scent of files that had thawed once and been refrozen and were now neither use nor poison. She had logged that smell 100 times without ever once stopping to find it strange. The chair stopped her. It sat against the wall at the second cold room, square in the corridor where the marble dipped toward a floor drain, a plain wooden chair of the kind that furnished the chapel anterooms 3 levels up. Honey-colored wood, a worn seat, one stretcher mended with wire. It did not belong. Nothing in the vault levels was wood. Wood warped in the damp and was forbidden below the census floor by the same ordinances that governed everything else. And the cold room behind it should have been sealed. She could see the seal tap on the door, the wax disc with its pressed thumb mark, intact and official in meaning, by every rule she had ever served, that no living person had cause to sit outside it through the long cold hours of a night. She stood and looked at the chair the way she looked at a number that would not reconcile. Wouldn't, if I were you. Brannock Sells was working a mop along the far stretch of the corridor near the next drain, and he had not looked up, and she understood that he had watched her arrive without seeming to. The janitor moved his mop in the same slow figures the water made on the marble. He was a soft, grey, unremarkable man, the sort the eye slid off of, which she would only later understand was a thing he had made of himself on purpose. "Looked at it long enough," he said. "It'll stay looked at. It shouldn't be here." Her own voice sounded thin in the cold. "Wood isn't permitted below the floor." "No," Brannock agreed pleasantly, mopping. And yet, he worked a stubborn bead of damp into the drain and watched it go. There come the night before an airing. One night, sometimes 2. Down here, up by the armory passage, outside the cold rooms. You'll find them set out tidy as Sundays. He paused the mop. And by the bell, they're gone. Carried back up wherever chapel chairs go. You could set your shifts by it better than by the saints, if you were the kind to notice such things. She thought of St. Vaho's ward, aired on schedule the morning before. She thought of the 11. Who sits in them? For the first time the mop stopped entirely. Brannock did not look at her even then, but something in the line of his shoulders changed, settled, the way a man settles who has decided how much he will spend. "You're the registrar," he said. "You know how this works better than I do. A thing's true when it's written and sealed and not before and not after. That's the whole of it. That's the city." He set the mop moving again. "So I'd think careful, mistress, about what I let myself write down. Because a form's a kind of confession, isn't it? Says here's what I saw. Says here's what I knew." The water hissed under the bristles. "Don't log what you can't survive having written. That's not me being cruel. That's the kindest thing anyone said to you all week, and you'll see it by Kalena's Day." He moved off down the corridor with his bucket, unhurried, leaving the chair where it stood and the drain where it ran, and the cold room sealed behind its honest thumbprint. Aurelius stayed a moment longer. Then she did the careful thing, the trained thing, the thing she had always trusted. She memorized the chair's position and the serial on the door seal, and she told herself that Inspector Morrow would know what it meant, because Morrow knew the ordinances, and the ordinances were the part of the world that did not lie. She went up to find him. The slip lay between them on Morrow's desk like something he was about to bless. His office sat at the joint of 2 promethium lines, and the pipes ran warm through the wall behind his chair, so that this was the only heated room Aurelius had stood in for days. The warmth made her aware of how cold she had been. Steam ticked in the joints. On the desk, beside the slip, a tin cup of recaf had gone skinned and grey, and Morrow had a way of turning it a quarter circle without drinking, as though the cup were a small dial he was setting. She had laid it out plainly. The intake counts from St. Veho's ward. Her own tally, sealed at the 7th bell. The clean-up unit's figure beneath it, and the place where the wax had been pressed over a number that had been a different number first. She did not raise her voice. She had practiced saying it in the corridor so that it would sound like procedure and not like an accusation, because she did not want to accuse. She wanted, very simply, to refile. Morrow listened the whole way through. That was the part she would keep returning to afterward. He did not interrupt her, did not glance at the door, did not let his hand stray to the cup until she had finished. He listened the way a good man listens, leaning slightly toward the trouble. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, and the smile had real warmth in it, and that was worse than anything he could have said. "You've done exactly what a registrar should," he told her. "I want you to know that. You caught it. You brought it up the line. That's the system working. Then we can refile the count. The count's authoritative." He said it gently, as one explains a thing that is a comfort once understood. The cleanup unit's tally is the count of record, by ordinance. Not because they're cleverer than you, God knows they're not, you've half their letters, but because someone has to be last. The clearance has to close on one number, or it never closes. He turned the cup a quarter. If your figure and theirs could both stay open, nothing would ever fire. And then nothing would ever air. 11 souls, she said. 11 on a slip that was rounded after the bell. I've seen worse arithmetic from crews I'd trust with my mother. He leaned back, and the warmth went out of his face into memory, and she saw she had touched the thing he kept. My ward was Tamsin Low. Year of the long fever. We were marked, the whole district. We knew the bell was coming for us, and we sat in our rooms and waited to be aired with the rest. And the calendar held it. The count came back under threshold, and the guns turned to Hesper instead. And I am sitting here because a tally I never saw said I was alive. He looked at her. It has never been wrong about who was dead. Not once, in living memory. You're asking me to believe it's wrong now because a number got tidied. She understood then that he was not lying. That was the thing she carried out of the heated room and back into the cold of the corridor. He had not lied to her once. He believed the calendar the way she believed the ledger, and the calendar had reached into a marked ward and lifted him out of it, and a man does not interrogate the hand that did that. He could not afford to look. To look was to make the tally that saved him into the same tally that buried someone else. And no one could be asked to hold both of those at once and keep getting up in the morning. He filed her concern as she watched. She saw him write the word, overzealous, in the small disciplined hand of a man who meant it kindly, who thought he was protecting her from her own thoroughness. He told her to rest. He told her the next airing was routine. He turned the cup a final quarter and did not drink it. She thanked him, because that was the form, and went back out past the warm pipes into the marble cold. In the corridor, the air tasted of the cryo-sumps, sour sweet, the spoiled medicine smell that came up from below when the cold rooms were opened. She stood with the slip in her hand. The refiling was closed to her now. She had taken the only door and it had shut, gently, with gratitude, which left the other figures. The ones no ordinance made authoritative. Somewhere below her feet, Brannock kept a ledger of who the vaults actually held. The refusal came not as a slammed door, but as a form. Morrow had filed it himself, considerate to the last, and given her the carbon registrar's query, reviewed, no action. So she would have something to keep. She'd kept it. She walked back through the census house with it folded in her sleeve against her wrist, where she could feel the edge of it, and she did not go up to her hall. She went down. The stairs to the cryosumps were old stone with rain in the joints, water that had come a long way to weep here, and the cold came up to meet her before the dark did. Brannock was at the bottom with his mop and his bucket of grey water, working a stain that would not lift. He did not look surprised. He had the face of a man who had stopped being surprised as a survival measure, the way other men stopped drinking. "I need the occupancy logs," she said. "The volcans." "By ward. Those are sealed. You have the keys to the sumps. The sumps run under the vaults." She had thought about this on the stairs. "The maintenance ledgers count bodies in cold storage so the coolant drawer can be built. But count isn't sealed. That count is plumbing." For a long moment he rung them up. Then he led her, without a word, to a wall of brass-mouthed tubes and a book chained to a desk, and he unlocked the chain, and he went back to his stain so that whatever she did she would do alone. She laid her intake slips out on the cold marble. She had brought them all, St. Veo's ward, the 3 before it, the soot-marked maps with her own small hand crowding the margins. The maintenance ledger gave coolant draw by vault, by night, in litres, and litres were honest, because no saint cared about litres. A body in cold storage drew a known and constant cold. She could count the dead by how hard the machines had worked to keep them. The arithmetic took an hour. Her fingers went stiff and she breathed on them and kept on, because the cold was only cold and the numbers were the numbers. St. Veho's ward had been logged at 240 fatalities. The clean-up unit slip said 240. Her own ledger said 229. The 11. She had known the 11. The coolant drawer said 61. She read it again. She checked the vault index against the ward seal and the date against the shift bell, and she read it a third time, and the number did not move, because numbers, unlike men, could not afford to look away either. 61 bodies in cold storage out of 240 declared dead. The other 179 had drawn no cold at all. They had not been in the vaults. They had not been corpses to be stored. They had been somewhere warm. She sat down on the floor without deciding to, her back against the brass tubes, the maintenance book open across her knees, and she understood the shape of it, the way you understand a smell before you name it. The sour sweet of spoiled medicine drifting from the recovery cots, the smell of wards that were not emptying because the sick were getting better. That was the thing the slips were built to hide. Not a plague that killed faster than she could count. A plague that had begun, in places, to let people go. A ward of the recovering was a scheduling problem. The guns were set to air it. The calendar had named the hour a year ago, before anyone in that ward had coughed, and so the count was made to fit the gun. The living were entered as dead, not by error, not by a tired crew rounding up, but on purpose and in good order, because the alternative was to admit that the schedule could be wrong, and the schedule had never, in living memory, been wrong about who was already dead. It had simply made certain it never had to be. "Brannock," she said. Her voice came out level. That frightened her more than anything had yet. The chairs in the corridor. The night before an airing. The mop stopped. "They're not for the dead." She was not asking. "No," he said, to the floor. "The dead don't need to be sat down." She looked at the slip on her knee. The altered number. The wax thumbprint pressed over the correction. A clean-up clerk's print. Above it, on the firing clearance, there would be another print. Larger. Sealed in the chapel where the light was good and the marble was warm enough to take a clear impression. Hers. She had pressed it 240 times into St. Veho's ward. She did not yet let herself follow that thought to its end. But she had stood up, and she was already climbing the wet stairs toward the warm rooms where she did her sealing to look at her own thumb. The discrepancy was no longer a number she could carry up a flight of stairs and set on someone's desk. It had become a shape, and the shape was her own hand. Aurelis sat in the census hall after the lamps were trimmed low, the occupancy logs and the intake slips laid side by side on the marble like two halves of a thing that had been torn and badly mended. Cold came up through the floor the way it always did, into the soles of her feet, into the small bones of her fingers. Somewhere below, water moved in a stone joint, patient, finding its level. She had thought, walking back from the cryo-sumps with Brannock's grudging tally folded in her sleeve, that she now understood the harm, that a crew counted the living as dead and the guns obliged. She had not yet understood her place in it. She understood it now, slowly, the way one understands a draft, not by seeing it, but by the candle bending. She drew a fresh clearance form from the drawer. St. Veho's ward, the one already aired. She read it as though, for the first time, as though she were a stranger, appointed to her own chair, and she followed the document down its length, the way she followed a corpse through intake, ward, hour, saint's day, tally, and then, at the foot, the smooth oval where the wax went. The tally above it was the cleanup units. False? She knew that now. But a false tally was only ink. It cleared nothing. It killed no one. It sat on the form, inert, a lie waiting. What made it lawful was the seal. Her seal. The warm press of her thumb into the wax, the ridgelines of her own skin closing the document like a wound. The gun priests did not read tallies. They could not. The slips passed through too many hands, too fast before each barrage. They read the thumbprint. They had been taught, she had been taught, that the thumbprint meant a registrar had cross-checked the count against the ledger and found the ward already empty of the living. The print was the city's promise to itself. It was the single mark that converted a number somebody had invented into permission to fire on people who were breathing. She had pressed it 1,100 times. More. She did not know the true figure and was, for the first time in her life, afraid to count. The smell of the old wax was on her hands, sour sweet, the way spoiled medicine smells, and she found she could not stop noticing it. She had loved that smell once, in the private, unspeaking way she loved the ledger, the warm honey rot of it, the proof that an entry was finished, sealed, beyond argument. Tenderness, she had thought. A small tenderness paid to the dead, the only one her office permitted. She had been wrong about the direction of the gift. The seal had never faced the dead. It faced the guns. It had always faced the guns. She set her thumb against the cold blank form and did not press. Her humility, she turned the word over and it cut her. She had built her whole working life out of the assumption that the fault, when a count failed, lived on her side of the desk. She refiled. She re-walked. She apologized to no one and corrected herself in silence and called it diligence. That instinct, that reflexive turning inward, was not a flaw the system tolerated. It was the system's instrument. A proud registrar would have demanded the cleanup unit account for the altered slip and made noise enough to be heard. A humble one assumed her own arithmetic was wrong, fixed nothing she could not fix quietly, and sealed the form. She had been chosen for the chair, she saw, the way a key is chosen for a lock, not for her honesty, but for the exact shape of her doubt. Doubt that always pointed home. The rain had got into the stone above the window and was tracking down the inner wall in a thin, bright line. She watched it find the seam in the marble and follow it, because marble too has a calendar, a path worn so deep the water no longer chooses. She needed proof that ran the other way. Not that the counts were false. She had that, and Morrow had already taught her what a false count was worth in his hands, nothing, a registrar's nerves. She needed proof that the firing came first, that the order to air award was issued before any tally existed to justify it. A tally could be argued. A timestamp could not. And only one office in Hellevar Expanse held the authorizations under seal, dated, kept apart from the census entirely so the two could never be made to agree. The armory. Idris Lome, and the keys she carried like a thing she was afraid to set down. The armory sat at the cold heart of the census house, where the marble never warmed, and the rain came through the stone joints in slow threads, leaving rust-colored maps on the floor that no one washed away. Aurelius went down to it the way she did everything, with her ledger under her arm and her thumb still faintly tacky with old wax. She had not decided what she would say. She had only decided that she could no longer be the woman who pressed the seal without knowing what the seal pressed back. Sister Custodian Idris Lome kept the barrage authorization keys in a brass cabinet behind her chair, and she was sitting in that chair when Aurelius came in, and she did not stand. That was the first wrong thing. Lome was a stander. She rose for inspectors, for gun priests, for the rats that crossed her threshold. She stayed seated now, both hands flat on the cabinet's lock plate, as though she were keeping it shut against weather. "You've come about the counts," Lome said. "I've come about the order of them." Aurelius set the ledger on the cold table between them. "The clearance is dated after the tally. Always after. That's the rule. The dead are counted, then the ward is cleared. But the keys hold a different time, don't they? The keys remember when the firing order was actually issued." Lome's eyes went to the cabinet and would not come back. The room smelled of brass polish and, under it, something sour-sweet, the spoiled medicine smell that clung to every cold room in the house. The smell of vials that had outlived the patients they were filled for. "You should not ask me to open it," Lome said. "I'm not asking you to open it. I'm asking you what's inside it." The custodian laughed, once, a dry, small sound with no floor under it. "What's inside it is the truth you already carried down the stairs. You only want me to say it so the saying isn't yours alone." She turned her hands over, palms up, as if checking them for something. "Fine. Yes. The firing orders are cut first. They've always been cut first. Sinvejo's order was sealed in the armory 8 days before the airing. St. Kelena's is sealed already. It's been sealed since the spring inventory. The gun knew it would fire before anyone in that ward knew they were sick." Aurelius stood very still. The cold came up through her shoes. "Then the tally. The tally is written backward." Lome said it gently, the way you tell a child a hard thing. "You think the dead set the schedule. The schedule sets the dead. Every airing has a number it must reach to be lawful, and the cleanup units only labors to reach it. If the plague obliges, they copy God's arithmetic and go home early. If it doesn't oblige," she stopped. Rain ticked in the stone. "They make up the difference out of whoever's nearest and breathing." There it was, laid flat on the cold table, and it did not look like a monster. It looked like a procedure. That was the part Aurelius would not afterward be able to unsee, how reasonable it was, how well formed, a closed loop that needed no cruelty in any single hand, because the cruelty was distributed across all of them, one slip, one count, one seal at a time. The guns were not aimed at the plague. They had never been aimed at the plague. The plague was the alibi the calendar wore. "It's not a failure," Aurelius said slowly, testing the shape of it. "I kept looking for the place it broke. The miscount. The sloppy crew. There's no break. It does exactly what it was built to do. Now you understand why I sit down when you come in." Lome's voice had gone to a whisper, and her hands had found the lock plate again. "The ones who stand get noticed. I learned that watching the last registrar learn it." She looked up at last, and her face was the face of someone who had been afraid for so long that fear had become a kind of posture, a way of holding the spine. "You want proof. Dates, keys, the order of things. I can give you that. But proof is a door, Registrar, and I'll only open it once, and I'll not be able to close it behind us." Aurelius thought of the chair in the service corridor, outside the cold room that should have been sealed, and how Branish had said they came the night before every airing and were gone by the bell. She had thought it an annoyance. She had thought a great many things were annoyances. "Show me where they sit them," she said. Lome took a single key from the brass cabinet and stood. Lome did not take her up toward the firing galleries, but down, through a stairwell where the marble sweated and the promethium lines ran in their conduits like veins gone to fat. The keys at her belt did not jingle. She held them in her fist to keep them quiet. Auralis followed the way she followed any procedure she did not yet understand, closely, counting steps, because counting was the rail she held when there was no other. The passage below the armory was long and badly lit, the kind of corridor a city forgets it built. Rain had found the stone joint somewhere far above and come down here patient and cold, beading on the ceiling, dropping. And along the left-hand wall, set at intervals as even as ledger lines, stood the chairs. Plain wooden chairs. The same as the one outside the cold room. The same as the one that had annoyed her outside the census hall a lifetime of 3 days ago. A dozen of them, more, receding into the dark in a row so deliberate it could only have been measured. Each sat a little out from the wall. Each faced the same direction, toward the long iron grate of the central drain. And the floor between the chairs and the grate had been mopped, was being mopped, now in slow grey arcs. Brannock did not stop when he saw them. He worked the mop head into the channel where the flagstones dipped, the way a man works a thing he has worked 1,000 times, and the water that came up off the stone was not clean. It was sour-sweet, the smell of spoiled medicine, of fever broth left to turn, of the recovering wards she had lobbed as aired. She knew the smell. She had built a career on never having to stand inside it. "You knew," she said. "I mop where I'm told." He wrung the head into his bucket. "Same as you sealed where you were told." She made herself look at the chairs and not at him. She made herself do the arithmetic, because the arithmetic was the only tenderness available, and she would not abandon it now. One survivor to a chair. Seated. She could see how it would go, could see it the way she saw a tally board after the candles were lit. They would walk in on their own feet, the ones well enough to walk, the recovering, the spared, told they were being moved to a cleaner ward, to a counting station, to anywhere. They would sit. Someone with a slip and a stylus would take a name, take a number, and the number that went down would not be the number that stood up. Recorded as a fatality. Then removed before the bell, down the channel, across the floor. Brannock kept clean, so that the next one to be seated would see nothing on the stone to make them refuse the chair. 11, that should have been 12. She understood finally what the 11 were. Not a miscount. A capacity. A line that had run one short of its quota, and someone had pressed wax over the gap to make the books balance against guns that were already loaded. "They sit them down," she said. It was not a question. She was reading the room aloud the way she read a ward map. "They take the count here." Then the count walks back upstairs his paper, and the people. She stopped. "The people go where the water goes." Brannock dipped the mop again. He still would not look at her, and she understood that too now. It was not indifference. It was the only way he had found to survive standing in this corridor every eve before an airing. "You log nothing. You cannot survive having written." He had told her that. He had been telling her the whole time. Lome's voice came thin off the wet stone. "St. Kelena's is the overflow ward." The keys shifted in her fist. "The big one. Tomorrow's bell. They've been moving the recovering into the overflow for weeks, telling them it's the safe ward, the cleared ward." "It's not cleared," she swallowed. "It's full. It's the fullest it's ever been. That's why this year's slip was the highest count I've ever signed keys against." Auralis looked down the row of chairs into the dark and did the last sum she would ever do innocently. The largest day of the year. The fullest ward. A clearance not yet sealed, because the slip was on her table, upstairs, waiting for the one thing that turned a lie into law. Her thumbprint. She felt the wax of it under her own skin. The old habit of the seal, warm and ready, and hers. The rain came down off the ceiling, one drop onto a chair, and ran into the grate. The cold room ledger came up clean, which was the worst thing it could have done. Auralis carried it to her hall under her coat, the spine of it cold against her ribs like a second, slower bone, and laid it open on the marble where she sealed her clearances. St. Kelena's Day. The largest airing of the year. The schedule had printed it weeks ago, the way it printed everything weeks ago, and she had stamped a dozen lesser clearances since, without once reading the saint's name at the top of the page. She read it now. The firing grid for Kalena's bell laid its angles across the eastern districts, the way rain laid itself across the courtyard stones outside, finding the low places, pooling where the joints had cracked. The lowest place was the overflow ward, the refugee ward, the ward where, by every intake slip she had crosswalked these last 4 days, the recovering had been quietly massing, pallet against pallet, the sour-sweet reek of spoiled medicine, men and women who had survived the thing the guns were meant to mercy kill. The cleanup unit had them down as 409 fatalities. Brannach's occupancy log had the cold rooms half empty. They were not in the cold rooms. They were in the ward. And the ward was going to be aired at the bell. She set her thumb on the slip. The wax cup sat at her elbow, the little brazier under it keeping the seal soft, and the smell of old melted wax was the smell of her entire life, every hour of every saint's day pressed flat under her own print. Press the thumb, and 409 living souls became, in the eyes of every gun priest on the eastern line, 409 already dead. The barrage would clear a graveyard that was not yet a graveyard, lawfully, on schedule, with her tenderness, the final signature on it. Don't, she told herself, and did not move her hand, and understood for the first time exactly what she was for. The slip lay there with its corrected number under its little patch of someone else's wax. She had spent 20 years believing the seal was the end of a sentence the city had already written. It was not. The seal was the verb. Without it, the sentence did not act. A falsified tally was, until her thumb came down, only a lie on paper, and lies on paper could be refiled, queried, sent back up the line with a query tapped, fluttering from the corner like a moth. The thumbprint was the thing that turned the lie into a law. They had built her humility into the mechanism the way they built the brazier, under the wax, a small steady warmth, doing the part of the work no one wanted to call work. She could refuse. The thought arrived plainly without heat, the way her best arithmetic always did. She could leave the slip unsealed. An unsealed clearance could not be overridden quietly. It had to go up. It would summon the whole procession of clearance officers to the chapel queue before the deadline bell, every one of them obliged to resolve it in the open, under the saint's day eyes. The falsification would have to be looked at. Someone would have to read the corrected number aloud. And the audit those officers convened would by ordinance name the registrar first. Always the registrar first. The seal was the registrar's, so the failure of the seal was the registrar's. She knew the form. She had filed adjacent to it 100 times without once imagining her own name in the blank. Morrow was already watching her ledger. He had been watching it with real gratitude since the day she brought him the altered slip, and he filed her concern as overzealousness. He watched the way a man watches a stove he has been told is cold, certain it is cold, checking anyway. He would not lie to the auditors. He would simply tell them the truth he could afford, that Registrar Venn had grown irregular, that she queried tallies, the ordinance called authoritative, that her count in the units had diverged before, and she had not let it rest. Every word of it accurate. Every word a stone. Rain found a new joint in the wall and began, somewhere above her, to count itself drop by drop into the dark. Lomi had the keys. The keys could prove the firing order had gone out before the death count was ever finished, proof that the deaths were invented to fit the guns and not the other way round. If the keys reached the chapel queue before the bell. If Lomi was not stopped between the armory and the door. Hours. She had hours. Aurelius lifted her thumb from the slip and did not press it down. The clearance lay on the marble between them. The override box still unsealed, the wax warming in its little brass cup the way it warmed every morning of her working life. Aurelius looked at it. She thought of all the mornings she had not looked at it, had only pressed her thumb down while reading the next slip in the stack. The gesture so automatic, that her thumb knew the heat better than her mind ever had. She set her hand flat on the desk instead. Palm down. Print up. Seal it, said the runner in the doorway, a boy of maybe 14, soot in the creases of his knuckles. St. Helena's clearance registrar. They're holding the queue. I know what they're holding. It has to go up sealed. Then it will go up the way it is. She slid the box across the marble toward him, unsigned. The corrected number still showing under the smear of another printer's wax, 11 that should have been 12, 12 that should have been hundreds. The boy did not take it. He looked at the empty space where her thumbprint should have been, the way you look at a stair that isn't there in the dark, the lurch of a body trusting a thing that is not present. Then he ran. Not from her. To the queue, to the next officer up the chain, because an unsealed clearance does not stop. That was the part she had understood too late and understood completely now. The schedule did not require her yes. It only required that her no be processed. Rain found the joint in the chapel wall behind her and traced down the stone in a thin, cold line. She could smell the overflow ward from here, even through 3 floors of granite, the sour, sweet reek of spoiled fever medicine. The smell she had been taught meant death, and now knew meant the opposite, meant lungs still working hard enough to be given the wrong drug, meant the living breathing in tears below the gums. Morrow came at the 3rd bell quarter. He did not shout. He never would. He stood in the doorway with his line inspector's cap held against his chest like a man at a graveside, and his face was full of something worse than anger, which was sorrow, which was the genuine grief of a man watching someone he respected step off a roof. You didn't seal it. No, Auralis. He said her given name. He had never once said her given name. Whatever you found, the calendar found it first. It always has. You think you're the first registrar to count high, a small, terrible patience. Unrequired to report an unsealed clearance. You know that. I filed it before I came down. I came down to tell you to your face. I know you did. They'll audit your ledger before they touch the cruise. He said it gently, as a kindness, as the warning it was. It names you first. It was always going to name you first. I know that too. He waited for her to take it back. There was a moment. She felt the shape of it, the old smooth groove her thumb wanted, when she could press the print and turn the morning back into every other morning. He waited in that moment with his cap against his chest. Then it passed, and she watched it pass over his face, the closing of a man who has offered the last thing he has and seen it refused. He put his cap back on. That was all. He put his cap back on and went up to do the thing the ordinance required, and the ordinance was faster than she was. She learned the rest in fragments, carried down by frightened clerks. Lome detained at the armory before the 2nd hour, held with the very keys that proved the firing orders predated the death counts. The keys now inventory in a case file no one would open before the bell. The unsigned clearance had not been withdrawn. It had been escalated, and escalation in Hellebar Expanse had only one terminus, emergency ordnance, the provision for clearances that could not be resolved in time, which authorized the barrage on the schedule's authority alone. Her refusal had not jammed the machine. It had tripped the override built precisely for refusals. She sat down in the cold of the census hall with her ledger open to St. Helena's Day, the column ruled and waiting. Above her, through the stone, she could hear it beginning. The processional bells, the shuffle of the Saints' Day crowd massing in the forecourt, the clearance officers filing into the chapel queue to settle a question that had already been settled by ordinance an hour ago. All of them moving. All of them in their proper lines. She uncapped her pen. The bell was not yet rung. There was still time to begin counting. The bell did not ring all at once. It came up through the floor first, the deep priming shudder of the Kalena gun line drawing breath beneath the city, and Auralis felt it in the marble before she heard it, the way she had always felt it, the way she had taught herself to feel it, so the count could begin clean on the first stroke. She was in the forecourt because the queue had carried her there. That was the thing she would remember. If remembering were permitted to her, she had not chosen the chapel steps. The clearance had gone up unsigned, and an unsigned clearance summoned its officers, and its officers gathered where ordinance said clearances were resolved, the seal table beneath the Kalena arch, above the overflow ward. So they came. The clearance procession in its grey, the Saints' Day crowd in its rags and its hope, all of them funneled by the same low rope lines that had channeled processions through this court for 200 years. She watched the geometry assemble itself and understood that no one had built it for this. That was worse. The crowd pressed toward the chapel doors, because the doors were where mercy was dispensed on a saint's day, a thumb of oil, a ladle of warmed broth, a name read from the living register so the bearer knew the guns would pass them by. The recovering had come up from the overflow ward to hear their names read. They stood in the broad apron of stone directly above the ward they had crawled out of, because the rope lines bent them there, because the seal table sat at the apron's lip, because everybody in the court was leaning toward the one place that promised it was safe. Aldous turned and tried to move against the lines and could not. There was a child's hand in her sleeve, not gripping, only carried along, a small thing borne on the same current. Sour, sweet smell off the crowd, spoiled medicine, the chalky reek of fever-broken skin, the medicines they'd been given to recover, the recovery itself made into an odor. They smelled of getting better. 11, she thought, and then could not stop. 11 that should have been 12. She had started this with a discrepancy of 11, and now the discrepancy was the whole forecourt, 400, 5, leaning toward a table where no thumbprint would ever be pressed because she had refused to press it, and the refusal had changed nothing at all. A clearance officer at the table was reading the override aloud in the flat voice of a man reciting weather. By emergency ordinance, the airing of the Kalena overflow proceeds as scheduled. He did not look up. There was a wooden chair set behind him, plain, ordinary, dragged from some corridor and left at the table's corner, and an underclerk sank into it to sign the override in her stead, sat down in the wrong chair, in the wrong corner, and put a wax thumb to the page, and Auralis watched her own refusal be seated and overruled in the space of a breath. The chair had found its last use. Someone had been moved who should not have been, herself. The bell rang. Not metal. The gun line's first stroke was the bell now, had always been the bell. The city had only ever called it by the saint's name. The marble jumped. The arch shed 200 years of dust in one grey exhalation, and the dust hung, and through it the apron of the forecourt simply was not there in the way it had been a moment before. The rope lines had done their work. The processional had delivered the procession. She did not see bodies fall so much as see the crowd's careful order, the queue, the lean, the press toward the promised doors, resolve all at once into the shape of the impact, as if the geometry had been the target all along and the people only its filling. The broth ladler rang on the stone. That she heard. She was still standing. The child's hand was gone from her sleeve, and she did not look for where it had gone, because looking was not counting, and she had only counting left. She began. 400, she made it, then corrected herself. Humility, even now, the habit they had built her around. 440, the apron's full standing load at Saints' Day density, less the clearance grey who'd stood behind the table's shelter. She fixed the hour. She fixed the saint. She pressed the figures into the place in her memory where the wax thumb would go, because the ledger would want them tonight, and the ledger was the only tenderness she had ever been permitted, and the city would already be drafting the line that named her the cause. She counted. The dust came down like the rain that never reached the deep joints of the stone, and she counted. And somewhere a schedule was already printing the next Saint's Day. The chapel forecourt was washed by the next morning. They did it the way they did everything in Hell of our Expanse, on schedule, with promethium hoses and lime, the wash crew working the seams between the marble flags where the rain still pooled pink. Aurelius watched from the census hall window. She had not been arrested. That surprised her until she understood it, and then it did not surprise her at all. You could not arrest a clerical irregularity. You corrected it. The notice came by the second bell. A new registrar had been appointed to the sanitary census, a younger woman, narrow-shouldered, who arrived with her own seal ring already cut, and her own wax already warm, which meant the order to replace Aurelius had gone out before St. Helena's Day, before the barrage, before there was anything to replace her for. The schedule had known. The schedule always knew. Aurelius signed the transfer of the ledger keys with a steady hand and noticed, distantly, that her humility had not left her even now. It had only changed jobs. The altered slip procedure was reviewed. She knew because they sent her the review as a courtesy, 2 pages of close print on the proper handling of cleanup unit tallies, concluding that the procedure was sound and was hereby reaffirmed. The single recommendation was that registrars be reminded not to cross-reference Gene Vault occupancy logs, which fell outside their competency and introduced error. Brannock's logs. They had closed the one door she had pried open and called the closing a clarification. She went down to the cryo-sumps once more, the last time, while the new registrar settled into the hall above. The cold came up through her boots. The corridor outside the sealed cold room held its chair again, carried back, righted, set square against the wall with the legs in the same 4 pale rings worn into the stone by all the airings before. Someone had wiped it. The seat was clean. Brannock was mopping 10 feet off, not looking at it, not looking at her, his bucket sour sweet, with the smell of spoiled medicine that never fully left the drains. "They put it back," she said. It was never gone for long. He wrung the mop. "It's a good chair. No sense buying another." She wanted to feel the anger then, fully, the way you feel heat when you finally hold your hands to a fire you have been near all night. It came. It was enormous, and it had nowhere to go. So she did what she had done with every fact in her life that exceeded her. She wrote it down. Not in the city's ledger. They had that one. They had sealed her old ledger into the archive already. She'd watched the wax go on, the official print, the tag that named it, evidence pertaining to a clerical irregularity, ward registry, Registrar A. Then, closed. No one would read it. The archive was bonded. The bond required cause. Cause required a complaint required a registrar, and the registrar was new and had been reminded what fell outside her competency. The ledger would sit in the cold with the rest, true in every figure, and the truth would keep perfectly, forever, the way the dead keep in the vaults. She wrote in the back of her own intake daybook, the cheap one, the one that was hers. She wrote the number 11, and then the number that 11 should have been, and then she wrote, in the small, even hand she used for everything, that she had known and had sealed it anyway for years before she counted, that the trusting was the mechanism and she had been the trust. She wrote that she was angry. She had never once written that. The word sat on the page looking ordinary, a word like any other, and she understood that this was the only place in the city it would ever be permitted to exist, a page no one would ever be allowed to read, which was the same as not writing it, which was perhaps why they let her keep the book. Above, the schedule printed. She heard the plate press clatter through the floor, the long ribbon of the coming month feeding out warm St. Orin's Day, St. Besca's, the lesser feasts, the shift bells, each ward and hour set against its barrage. The gun priests would be cleaning the long guns now, oiling the breeches, the ordinary blessed work. The city read the new schedule and trusted it exactly as it had the day before, no less and no more, because the city had not been wrong and then corrected. The city had never been confused. Brannock lifted his bucket and moved on down the corridor. The chair stayed where it was, square to the wall, waiting, clean, and Aurelis closed her little book and went up to count what came next.